Hello and welcome. Today, we have a special video celebrating the 30th anniversary of Sega's least memorable console, the Sega Saturn. To mark this milestone, we'll dive into the emulator that delivers the best quality for playing all these classics, Yaba Sanshiro 2. In my previous video, where I conducted a complete review of Saturn emulators, notable issues were present in major titles like Die Hard Arcade, which suffered from severe graphical problems. Additionally, some games faced challenges with controller compatibility. Fortunately, these issues have been addressed in recent updates, significantly improving the gaming experience. Although Yaba Sanshiro 2 is not yet the most accurate Saturn emulator, it excels in visual quality, bringing enhancements comparable to those of DuckStation, but for Saturn games. This video's goal is to showcase the best possible visual quality on the system, running games at up to 1080p resolution, along with a showcase of the platform's most iconic titles. If you're new to the Sega Saturn or missed out on its prime, this video will provide a solid starting point to explore the console. During the showcase, I'll also mention if the games highlighted are available on other platforms. In the video description, you'll find links to download Yaba Sanshiro 2 for Windows safely, along with details about the controller used during recordings. This controller is the 8-bit M30, a faithful reproduction of the original Saturn controller, perfect for nostalgic fans. By purchasing through these links, you directly support content creation. Now, let's briefly go over the main updates introduced in the emulator's last two updates, fixed multiple bugs and added new features. Improved full-screen functionality. Fully revamped and simplified user interface. Added Vulkan API support for Windows, previously available only on Android, enhancing stability. Migrated from Visual Studio 2017 to VS 2022. Updated Qt5 interface to Qt6. Added functionality for the emulator to list available games in your library. Improved compatibility with 8-bit M30 and Retrobit Sega Saturn controllers. Implemented an auto-update feature. Yaba Sanshiro 2 is available for Windows, Linux, iOS, Nintendo Switch, and Android. On Android, there are two versions, a free version and a paid version that offers extra features like cloud saves and support for accessing ROMs and other directories. I recommend the paid version, as the free one requires you to copy ROMs into the Android system folder. Before we get started, leave a like to support the production of videos like this. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel to receive future updates. Without further ado, let's jump into the games. Opening our showcase is Astal, a game often cited as a hidden gem on the Saturn. It runs perfectly on Yaba Sanshiro 2, with no performance issues or crashes. For those unfamiliar, Astal is a 2D adventure game featuring beautiful graphics and responsive gameplay. Playing it for the first time, I managed to reach the third stage, though the game didn't impress me as much as I expected. Still, it might be different for you. It's worth noting that Astal is exclusive to the Sega Saturn. Next is Burning Rangers, one of Saturn's classics. While it may not have aged well, it mainly involves rescuing people and escaping disaster zones, primarily fires. It remains a memorable experience. I never completed the game but recall getting close back in the day, and the overall experience was decent. To play it, I highly recommend configuring the analog stick, as using a digital controller can be frustrating. Visually, the game is stunning and showcases much of what the Saturn has to offer in 3D gaming. Burning Rangers is also exclusive to the Sega Saturn. Croc Legend of the Gobbos is another memorable title from the era that has aged well. A native version compatible with modern PCs will soon be released through GOG's preservation program. This platform game follows the classic formula of the Crash Bandicoot era but with different objectives, such as collecting crystals and rescuing creatures called Gobbos to progress through levels. The game is filled with secrets, and remains an excellent experience, especially for introducing children to gaming. Unfortunately, Croc has issues on Yaba Sanshiro 2, such as incorrectly rendered water and lava effects. Another drawback is its native 20 FPS, which limits the gameplay. On DuckStation, there is a hack to run it at 60 FPS, but it compromises character movement. The game was also released for PlayStation 1 and supports analog controls. Daytona USA is synonymous with nostalgia for many Saturn fans, as it often came bundled with the console. Despite a significant downgrade compared to the arcade version, which featured more detailed graphics and faster gameplay, it remains fun to play. A curious detail: after winning all the races, you unlock a horse as a vehicle to compete with opponents. On Yaba Sanshiro 2, the game runs without graphical issues and includes improvements such as enhanced shadows. It supports analog controls and has been re-released on various platforms. Dragon Ball Z Legends was one of the most surprising games for me at the time. While I waited for the Majin Buu saga to conclude on TV, I was able to experience the story through the game. For those unfamiliar with it, I recommend setting aside an afternoon to try it, especially if you're a fan of the anime. However, reaching the true ending can be challenging, as you must follow the hero's exact steps from the anime. The PlayStation 1 version, although available, is inferior, struggling with multiple 2D objects. To this day, the Saturn version remains the best for gameplay. Die Hard Arcade is a direct arcade port that made its way to home consoles exclusively on the Sega Saturn. Years later, it received a PS2 version, which can be considered a remaster with general improvements. If you enjoy Beat 'em UPS, this game is a hidden gem. It offers a good variety of weapons, innovative quick-time events for its time, dynamic environments during gameplay, and even costume changes for the characters. Though short, it has great replay value. On Yaba Sanshiro 2, texture issues have been resolved, allowing players to enjoy the game as it was intended. The home version remains exclusive to the Saturn. Castlevania Symphony of the Night needs no introduction. Often considered the greatest game of all time, the best Metroidvania, and the game with the best soundtrack, Symphony is still revered by fans. The Sega Saturn version was the first complete edition released for consoles, featuring additional areas and 2 extra playable characters compared to the PlayStation 1 version. However, it suffered limitations on the Saturn, mainly due to the console's dual GPU architecture, which was challenging to program for. This led to cuts in effects like transparency and shadows, as well as a loading screen every time the menu was accessed, something that happens frequently during gameplay. Another issue was the Japan-only release. Thankfully, the community has addressed many of these problems. Today, there is a translated version available in English, Portuguese, and other languages, along with patches to fix graphical effects. To play this version on an emulator, you'll need to emulate the 4 MB RAM expansion. The game has also received flawless ports for PSP, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 4. Although the Saturn lacked Tekken in its library, Sega compensated with several excellent 3D fighting games, the most remarkable being Fighter's Megamix. This title boasts exceptional replay value, allowing players to unlock quirky characters like the Daytona USA car, alongside fighters from Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers. Additionally, Fighter's Megamix introduced innovative mechanics, such as armor breaking, which increases damage dealt to opponents. Exclusive to the Saturn, the game runs flawlessly on Yaba Sanshiro 2. The Saturn also delivered incredible ports of 2D fighting games, especially those from SNK, such as the King of Fighters 97. For a long time, this was my favorite fighting game. The Saturn port is nearly perfect, though the audio may feel unusual for those accustomed to the arcade version. Nevertheless, this title remains a fantastic experience and has been ported to various platforms, including Steam. Speaking of 2D games, the Saturn is widely considered the home of this style. It received excellent Mega Man titles, and one of my favorites is Mega Man X4. Compared to the PlayStation 1 version, there are no significant differences. On Yaba Sanshiro 2, the game performs exceptionally well, with impeccable sound quality and stability. Later, Mega Man X4 was released on various modern platforms, but still retains its original essence on the Saturn. Staying with 2D fighting games, Capcom gifted us with an impeccable port of Marvel vs. Street Fighter. Unlike the PlayStation 1 version, which suffered significant limitations, such as the inability to switch between characters mid-fight, the Saturn port retains the original gameplay without frame cuts. This was the best console port at the time, provided you use the correct RAM expansion. On Yaba Sanshiro 2, there are no graphical issues, and the game includes filters like scanlines for those who prefer a retro aesthetic. After years of being locked to its original platforms, this classic was recently re-released for PCs and modern consoles with various improvements. Another must-play title that was groundbreaking for its time is Nights into Dreams. This game brought something innovative with its freedom of flight, where the main goal is to collect blue orbs to progress. Unlike many 2D games of the era that were trimmed to fit the limitations of early 3D consoles, Nights delivered a fluid, enchanting experience that remains relevant and enjoyable today. The game also supports analog controls, further enhancing gameplay. Currently, Nights is available on various modern platforms, including Steam. Road Rash stands out as one of the best versions of the game on the Sega Saturn. For those unfamiliar, the goal is to participate in motorcycle races, using weapons or melee attacks to knock down opponents and gain an advantage. At the time, it was revolutionary for its impressive graphics, sense of speed, and the option to choose different routes during races. However, due to its technical demands, this game will only run correctly on a well-optimized emulator like Yaba Sanshiro 2. It was also ported to multiple consoles and Windows, with adaptations for modern systems. Since the game is no longer officially available for purchase, it is now considered abandonware. Sega Touring Car Championship was Sega's attempt to compete with games like Gran Turismo, though the results were less polished. The game features checkpoint-based races where players must reach specific points before time runs out. Despite being a direct arcade port, its gameplay has aged poorly, making it frustrating for modern players. However, on Yaba Sanshiro 2, emulation brings significant improvements, such as more detailed polygons and enhanced shadows. This game is also available for Windows and supports analog controls. Now, let's talk about the reasons the Sega Saturn didn't achieve the same global success as other consoles of its time. Before the Saturn's release, Sega was already facing financial difficulties due to its confusing strategy with the Sega Genesis. Gadgets like the Sega CD and Sega 32X, which promised to expand the Genesis's capabilities, ended up fragmenting the market and disappointing consumers. The Sega CD saw only 209 games released, while the Sega 32X had just 40. Frustrating players and damaging the company's image. When the Sega Saturn launched, it came to the shelves hurriedly. Sega wanted to gain an advantage over the PlayStation by releasing the console ahead of its rival. This worked in Japan, where the Saturn gained some relative popularity, but the company made a strategic mistake in its design. Initially, Sega executives believed 2D games would continue to be the main focus of the industry. As a result, the Saturn was designed to be a powerhouse for 2D games. But when the market began to shift toward 3D graphics, as seen with Virtua Fighter, Tekken, and Ridge Racer, Sega scrambled to adjust. This change of direction led to the inclusion of an additional GPU to handle polygons and 3D games, but the implementation was rushed and problematic. Many third-party developers struggled to understand the console's complex architecture and deal with Sega's incomplete documentation. As a result, many ports to the Saturn, especially 3D games, were inferior compared to the PlayStation 1. A clear example of this is Resident Evil. On the Sega Saturn, the game had lower quality textures, less detailed 3D models, longer loading times, and reduced quality FMVs, showing how the Saturn was less efficient at handling 3D games. Beyond the technical aspects, the price also played a crucial role in the Sega Saturn's failure in the United States. While the PlayStation was released at $299, the Saturn was priced at $399, a $100 difference that weighed heavily on consumers' wallets. Sony's strategy was brilliant and became iconic at the 1995 E3. During the PlayStation 1 presentation, Sony's representative took the stage and simply said $299, referring to the price of the console. This was enough to earn applause from the crowd, even though many didn't yet know the product. This moment struck a devastating blow to Sega, which was already struggling to remain competitive. As everyone knows, the result was disastrous for Sega. The Saturn was quickly overshadowed by the success of the PlayStation. Shortly after, the company tried to rebound with the early launch of the Dreamcast, but it was once again defeated, this time by the PlayStation 2, which became one of the best-selling consoles of all time. The series of missteps and uneven competition led Sega to exit the hardware market and focus solely on software. And that's how this excellent console, full of memorable games, had such a tragic end. Thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next video.